Welcome everyone to this month's Fireside Chat and the last Fireside Chat of the year. The Fireside Chats are brought to you by the Office of Community Outreach and Engagement at the Masonic Cancer Center at the University of Minnesota. The Office of Community Outreach and Engagement serves as a bridge between the Cancer Center and communities across the state of Minnesota. Our team's mission is to reduce the burden of cancer in Minnesota by engaging communities and providing them access to knowledge and information on the latest cancer research, cancer prevention, the importance of screening and early detection, treatment options, survivorship, as well as clinical research opportunities. My name is Amna Hussein. I am the Community Engagement Coordinator on our team. And on behalf of our team, thank you so much for joining us today for a very important discussion about clinical trials. Clinical trials help inform our understanding of cancer and improve prevention, diagnosis, treatment, and care. They show us what works and what doesn't work in medicine and healthcare and help build the future of medicine. They are the best way to answer critical questions about treating cancer, finding and diagnosing cancer, preventing cancer, and managing the symptoms of cancer and side effects of cancer treatments. Today's clinical trials often become tomorrow's standard of care. Today, we are joined by two incredible panelists, Nisha Patel and Dr. Jeff Miller. So unfortunately, Nisha Patel had some power issues, and so she hopefully will be joining us during our conversation today. But Nisha brings with her a breadth of practical experience in pharmaceutical and healthcare industry for over 20 years. She holds a variety of different roles. She held a variety of different roles at Teva Pharmaceuticals and AstraZeneca, bringing leadership and a deep knowledge of the drug development process from molecule to medicine. She has expertise in multiple disciplines, including research and development, global medical affairs, operations, commercial, as well as the following therapeutic areas, including the central nervous system, oncology, and respiratory. Nisha started her career working in clinical practice at different health systems and outpatient clinics in Philadelphia. She holds an MBA from Drexel University and a Bachelor of Pharmacy from the University of Science in Philadelphia. She has a passion for education and communication with a focus on patients. In her current role at GSK, she is looking to make an impact towards inclusivity in clinical trials and overall health equity. Next, I would like to introduce Dr. Jeff Miller. Dr. Miller received his Bachelor of Science degree from Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois. And he received his medical degree from Northwestern University School of Medicine. He completed an internship and residency in internal medicine at the University of Iowa in Iowa City. After completing a postdoctoral fellowship in hematology, oncology, and transplantation at the University of Minnesota, he then joined faculty in 1991. Dr. Miller is currently a professor of medicine at the University of Minnesota and is also the Deputy Director of the University of Minnesota Masonic Cancer Center. He has more than 20 years of experience studying the biology of natural killer cells and other immune effector cells and their use in clinical immunotherapy, with over 300 peer-reviewed publications. He is a member of numerous societies, such as the American Society of Hematology, the American Association of Oncologists, a member of the American Society of Clinical Investigation since 1999. He serves on the editorial board for the Journal of Immunology and Transplantation and Cellular Therapy, and is a reviewer for a number of journals and National Institutes of Health grants. He was a recipient of the National Cancer Institute Outstanding Investigator Award for 2015. So I'd actually want to transition just a little bit to play a very short video that discusses some of the immunotherapy research that Dr. Miller has been a part of over the last few decades.
What if you could supercharge the immune system and use it to fight cancer? Immune cells keep your body healthy by identifying and destroying cells that can cause you harm. But cancer is often disguised as healthy cells, allowing them to grow into dangerous tumors undetected by the immune system. At University of Minnesota Health, in partnership with researchers at Masonic Cancer Center, we're developing a technique to help immune cells seek out and destroy cancer. This approach to cancer treatment, known as immunotherapy, is a precise treatment that targets cancer cells while ignoring healthy cells. Now, in clinical trials, we're treating leukemia patients by removing immune cells, activating them in a lab, and giving those natural killer cells the key to recognizing and destroying cancer. When the superpowered immune cells are injected back into the patient, they begin their search and destroy mission, finding cancer cells and killing them on the spot. For some patients, it's like a magic bullet that kills cancer, and the whole process looks like a simple blood transfusion. We're reinventing cancer care, and it's happening right here at University of Minnesota Health. Available at 6 different locations in the metro area.
All right, so as you just heard and saw, today we are joined by two incredible experts to lead our conversation about clinical trials. We will be recording today's session, so you can refer back to the recording on our YouTube page, and that is at Masonic Cancer Center. Before we begin, I would like our audience to get familiar with using the Q&A feature, which is located on the bottom of your Zoom window. During today's presentation, please use the Q&A feature to submit your questions. And then Nisha, who just joined us, and Dr. Miller will be available to answer questions live during our program today. Okay, without further ado, I will now hand it over to Nisha and Dr. Miller.
Great, thank you so much for that introduction. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you clear as day.
Great. I'm going to share my screen and we'll go through a short presentation on what clinical trials are before Dr. Miller and I have a conversation about it. Would that be okay? I want to at least start off by talking about the biopharmaceutical research and development process as it comes from the industry, which is what I'm representing. I work at a company called GSK where we research and develop medications. So this is kind of a brief overview on how the drug development process works. And what it does is the basic research, there is over thousands to millions of molecules that really get started in the lab, right? Which is basic research into trying to find making that molecule into a drug. That finally funnels into a preclinical and then clinical phase 1, 2, and 3 stages before it can get submitted as a new drug application to the FDA. FDA is the government that will basically approve any medications for use. And out of that, thousands or millions of molecules that started research, only one drug or one molecule makes it as a medicine that may be FDA approved. And this whole process takes over an average of 10 years, and it can cost up to $2.6 billion. So this is why I just wanted to kind of show you at a snapshot how the drug discovery process works. Moving into clinical research, well, there's two types of clinical research that we really kind of talk about in medical. There's the observational studies, and these studies are basically experiments that do not test any new treatments, but they observe. So they observe your behaviors and they want to understand how behaviors are in different situations. Then the other type of clinical research are clinical studies. Clinical studies is where you are kind of testing new ways to prevent, detect, and treat diseases. Treatments can be medications, they can be devices, or they can even be procedures that need to be tested. Once you have a treatment, a device, or a procedure, it must go through the 4 phases of clinical trials. So clinical trials is really broken down into 3 main phases, and then phase 4 is once it's approved. Phase 1 is really the first step, and we just want to make sure that molecule or drug is, safe. It's safe in healthy volunteers. So this is usually done in a small group of patients or participants, and they're healthy volunteers. So you're just trying to figure out if it's safe in healthy volunteers, and if you can, you want to try to get that dose correct. Once that's completed, it moves on to phase 2. Phase 2 is a little bit larger. It will require about 100 to 300 volunteers. And in this, you're still also testing for safety and efficacy, but now you're trying to see if it's effective in the disease being treated. So you want to take a smaller population of patients that have that disease that treatment is for. Once that happens, it moves on to phase 3. And in phase 3 is where you have a larger population. So you have more than hundreds and thousands of patients who are volunteers into that study. And you're studying the safety and efficacy in a variety of different populations. You want to try to test different dosage to see if it works maybe with different combinations of other medications. And once this phase is, successful, the FDA will then kind of look at the results of all 3 phases and determine if this is a product that can be safe for use for the general population of people who need that medication. So then the FDA gets approved, and once it's an FDA approved drug, your doctor can prescribe it, and it goes into phase 4. Phase 4 is basically just a continuous monitoring of safety and efficacy in a large population. So it's not a true clinical study, but it's just a monitoring of that medication. So what happens when you want to participate in a clinical trial? There are different steps to it. The very first step is determining, with you and your physician to see if you even want to participate in a clinical trial. So the first step is to understand what that trial is. What is that study for? And would you be a good candidate or participant for it? Once both, the physician and the nurse explain to you what that clinical study is going to be like, you need to decide, and then you will provide informed consent. So you can only provide consent to participate in a clinical trial once you are informed of what the clinical trial is. Once your informed consent is signed, then there will be a screening. So we want to make sure that you are a right participant, right? Do you have what the study is going to be used for? They have different parameters, which are called inclusion and exclusion criteria. Do you meet those inclusion and exclusion criteria? And these are usually based upon the disease and different labs and different pathology that you may have based on the disease and what the treatment and the study is for. So if you qualify that screening, then you will have your first baseline visit. And in the baseline visit, basically what happens is that, before you get the treatment that's being studied, they will take all your labs and, baseline information to make sure we know what it is before you started any of the experimented studies. What happens next is then you just get randomized into one of the treatment groups. And once that randomization happens, you follow the instructions on how that treatment must be taken and any of the procedures, and you report any issues that you may have, or if you have any questions, you follow up with the investigator. That's the physician that is doing the study. And you'll have regular visits to the investigator's site to collect the information. So they want to make sure what's happening, whether it's between different days or different weeks, they're monitoring your labs and the treatment until it's done. And throughout this whole process of a clinical trial, where you may see a different physician than your own physician, you still are being checked out by your own physician, and your continuation of your healthcare continues. So how do you learn about a clinical trial? Well, you can learn about a clinical trial in many different ways. The best way is to talk to your physician. See if there's a clinical trial that you may qualify for. You can also go to different registries, such as the clinicaltrials.gov. There's also a variety of different support groups that may also give you information on clinical trials. And then, of course, in the media, you may often find, advertisements of clinical trials. Now, clinical trials can be done, there may be, it's for disease, but it can also be for healthy volunteers, such as our vaccines. So often you can hear about these on the media. And some of the questions you want to ask, you want to be well prepared before you participate and have that conversation. So you definitely want to ask, what is the trial about? What kind of procedure they will have, what kind of the benefits of participating and taking that treatment. You want to ask about your own medical care. Does the continuation of your health care, do you continue your current medications? Is your reimbursement? A lot of the times, many times when you participate in if you're a caretaker, do you need health insurance to participate? So there are many different things that you may want to ask before you start. And after the trial ends, you want to continue to follow up on your health. And you want to also ask and find out the results of the trial. So, sorry. And the last slide is really on why it's important to have diversity in clinical trials. So as we talked about, it's very important to have a large population involved, because we're trying to find out how this medication or procedure or device works in the larger population. So you want to make sure anybody who is, affected by the disease is also included in the research. So that way we can get the study results that may have ability to the broader population. And so with that, I will open it up to Dr. Miller and, ask Dr. Miller, what are your thoughts on clinical trials and, what the patient how should the patient use clinical trials to empower their own treatment?
Yeah, Nisha, thanks for the very nice overview. So just for everybody who's out there, my name is Jeff Miller. I've been at the university for a long time, as you've heard, and I'm very much involved with clinical trials. In the phases of clinical trials that Nisha described to you, I mainly have been involved with these very early phase 1 trials. We run an active research lab, and as you saw in the movie, we study a cell type called a natural killer cell. And through those laboratory studies, we eventually find out what we think would be worthy of bringing into a clinical trial in patients. As Nisha outlined, these are initially small clinical trials, typically on the order of 20 to 30. And then we make a go or go no decision about whether or not to take that into a second phase. Or ultimately, the goal is to take it to clinical development with an industry partner to really try to change the standards of care. So with that overview, Nisha, do you want to start focusing on some of the questions we have, and we could just lead the discussion that way? And I encourage people to please tell us what you want to hear.
That would be great.
What are some of the main differences between clinical trials for drugs and medical devices? I think this is very much dependent on the disease that you have. As many of you, I imagine, are from the Twin Cities area. We have a lot of device companies in town. And I think that, the device companies are geared to the diseases where those devices serve. And I think one of the big ones in our local area is certainly cardiovascular devices, pacemakers and stuff like that. And I think to be eligible for those trials, in these new devices, you basically have to have a condition for which a sponsor, whether that be an individual investigator at the university, whether it be company driven through your doctors or through investigators that are really trying to understand if their device could gain FDA approval to eventually be marketed for standard of care and hopefully coverage by your third-party payer. Clinical trials that I do are actually with cell therapy. And I guess it's really the same, whether it's cell therapy or a drug therapy. Being in as a hematologist and medical oncologist, I think that most of the patients eligible for trials have active cancers, at least the trials that I do. And most of the patients have failed some type of standard therapy. And I think some of the questions that have come up pre-populated by the group are, when do I want to participate in a trial? What are the risks to me? I think as people get more advanced cancers and start failing standard therapy, like I deal with patients who have refractory leukemia, which means they have not responded to any of the standard therapies that are available. So it's typically a pretty easy decision if people feel well and want to keep trying. There is some part of cancer therapy that can be quite exhausting to patients. I think the one thing we remind people all the time is, you as an individual and how you're feeling and your goals in life have to dictate whether you would want to go onto a clinical trial. Some people are exhausted and may know that they're not going to be cured of their cancer. And there are important decisions which we absolutely respect if you say, I don't want more therapy. But if you do want more therapy and you failed standard therapy, it's really when we consider experimental therapies. And I think as part of the University of Minnesota community and being very involved in experimental therapeutics, what we try to do is have at least 1 or 2 trials for the stage or aggressiveness of the disease that you have. So if you have an advanced cancer, failed standard therapies, there are a whole bunch of new cell therapies that we've been working on, and we're very excited. We don't know if they're going to work at this very early stage 1 stage where we're really trying to identify what dose or schedule can we give and can we give this safety. But I guess, the most important thing I could remind the audience is it is your choice as an individual. You own your healthcare. You need to work with your doctors. If you want to hear more about clinical trials in your area, even if you've failed 5 other regimens, there are probably trials designed for you. If you don't want to hear about clinical trials, you are the driver of your healthcare. That's probably the most important thing that I can tell you. So again, just getting to the last point for the question, the clinical trial is dependent on what is being investigated and what disease you have. And remember, we're really not talking about clinical trials for normal volunteers where we're doing safety studies. Those can go on. We're really trying to approach this as, the recruitment for our clinical trials is really our cancer clinics within the mHealth system.
So there's a question that came in on how does one come to work for the FDA, and who are the people that decide to approve new drugs or new therapies? It came from Rachel. So thank you for that question. Yeah. I do want to, before I answer this question, there was another question that had come in pre the webinar, which was about ethics and trust. How can you trust to see if, are there any rules and protections in place for patients who participate in a clinical trial? So I kind of want to answer both at the same time. With the first part, what are the rules and protections for you as a patient? Every clinical trial here in the US must be approved and monitored by this board called the IRB, which is an institutional review board. And that's an independent board. It's not associated with the government or the health system or the pharma. It's an individual board that will review the protocol, the design of the study, and approve and make sure it protects the patient. Once it's approved by the IRB, then it can become a clinical trial. So that is a protection for the patients that you can feel confident in. And then as it comes to the FDA, people that work in the FDA are actually people that used to work in clinical practice. So they can be physicians, nurses, pharmacists. So there's a variety of practicing healthcare practitioners and scientists that work for the FDA. And they're the ones who, go on to approve the medication. Dr. Miller, would you want to add anything to that?
No, I absolutely agree. And I must say that we feel incredibly responsible to be very honest about what we know about experimental therapies. Even to the point that I must say patients have told me we give them sometimes too much information. It's very complicated, I think, when you have an advanced cancer or an early cancer, testing kind of two arms to understand which treatment may be better, which is the design of a phase 3 trial. But, we try to be as open and honest as we can of what we know and what we expect. And, the earlier we are in the development, despite what we think we know, we are actually learning through your participation. And this is why we try to keep a research team. We have a very dedicated clinical trials office, in addition to the clinical care team helping us keep track of the research endpoints and to follow, quote, the rules of the trial that needs to be approved both by the FDA and the IRB. And remember, the IRB is, a federal regulatory, the FDA is a federal regulatory agency. The IRB is really in place to make sure we are protecting you. And they are incredibly diligent in making sure that they're kind of the honest broker between you and us, and making sure that they independently assess our ability to tell you about risks and benefits. And I'm going to just address one more question because it's kind of along this timeline. And this is from John, and this is a really good question. How does the FDA apply different levels of scrutiny for oncology therapies versus therapies for other diseases? And I think this is a really outstanding question, which leads into some of the others. When we think of proposing, let's say, one of my NK cell therapies to a patient with refractory disease who's failed all standard therapy, they really have no known curative options, which is a required eligibility for the trial. And when we talk about the different risks and benefits, the FDA looks at these as well. And they will allow us to do more unknowns in advanced cancer patients who have failed standard therapies than it might be to test a new diabetes medication or a high blood pressure medication. And remember, the risk to those subjects needs to be way less and the benefit needs to be clear. I think with advanced cancer therapies where you have no standard options, the FDA recognizes that, since there is no benefit by what you've already have, that the risk-benefit ratio is a little bit different. And they're certainly more tolerant of a little bit more risk in allowing these trials to go forward with full disclosure and oversight of the IRBs to make sure you know exactly what you're getting into.
Yeah. Some of the other questions that had come in before, Dr. Miller, maybe we can talk about is how does one decide if they should participate in a clinical trial or not?
Yeah.
And I really would like to go back to focus on this whole, way that the patient, you should take charge of your treatment. Yeah. And remember that clinical trials you should really view it as another treatment option for your, for your disease that you're going through. And it's very important that you talk to your doctor. If your doctor is not an investigator, how do you find out that there's another clinical trial going on in the location where you are? And how can you get enrolled into that? It is something that's very important. And this goes back into making sure that we get a wide range of people who have the disease get enrolled into the studies, because that is the best way to predict the outcomes of that treatment that we're studying.
Yep. So I think this it's really a great thing. As I think we've said over and over again, this is a very individual decision. I think what's really hard, and one thing we're trying to do as part of the Masonic Cancer Center and our community engagement here is, we don't expect individual patient doctors in the community to know everything about what we do. But what we're trying to do is become more interactive and vocal to make sure that your doctor knows the trials we have. So, leukemia is a very small cancer. There's only 15,000 new cases in the year, and maybe 100 or so in the Minnesota area. But when we talk about lung cancer, breast cancer, colon cancer, the common solid tumors, they're very, very frequent. There's a lot of medical oncologists throughout the state. And what we're trying to do is make sure that they're at least informed. If your patient has, and remember, these trials are very much disease and stage oriented. So if you have advanced breast cancer, or colon cancer, or lung cancer, we have a list of trials that we're trying to make readily available both on our website, through a call line to the cancer center, or through some communications that we have with individual doctors, which is subgrouped by specialty areas. So I think what we're trying to make sure is that people who are interested in going on trials, if you failed standard therapy, it's kind of the easiest thing to want to look into, because you've exhausted standard options. Then I think you should start asking questions. Your doctor doesn't have to be an expert. They just have to understand that our goal is to take over for the experimental therapy and return patients back to their doctors when this therapy is completed. So this needs to be very much a close-knit, interactive orchestration of this. And it is a little bit more work and more effort. And you need to learn a lot and understand what you're getting into if you want to be a part of a clinical trial. Your motivation will be higher if you don't have any other good options. We sometimes study two kind of standard treatments side by side, and that's very much driven, I think, more so by our clinical practice, from the university or our affiliate hospitals. But I encourage you, if you've failed therapies, there might be something for you. There's been a big boom in cancer immune therapy, the type of work that we do. And I think that this is really going to grow over the next 5 years for all kinds of tumors. So please ask questions, look on the website, see if there's anything that might fit you. And we will make sure that we can get the information about your cancer to go through, as Nisha told you in one of the earlier slides, this screening phase to see, does your disease and stage and your overall health fit the eligibility for this trial, to see if it's a real option for you or not.
Yeah, and Dr. Miller, as somebody that's representing GSK, which is, a pharmaceutical company that often sponsors these studies, one thing I do want to add is that we also work, we work very closely with our investigators and our clinical trials, right? So even if your doctor may not be one of the investigators, as Dr. Miller said, you can still try to find a site local. And there are, there's a lot of things to remember, that there's a lot of resources available to you to help you participate, whether it's transportation costs, whether it is trying to work with your community physician to get to a site, and that communication. So we, the sponsor side that usually hosts the study also is made up of a large research team that has, physicians and nurses that constantly monitor and work with the sites and the community physicians. So I want to make sure that we kind of have a nice understanding of the different, the partnership as it relates to, the full spectrum of the clinical study. Would you agree, Dr. Miller, that there's a lot of education that goes back and forth? And we learn a lot from the physicians, right? We need to know what's going on with the patients and how do we need to maybe change different studies.
Yeah. And I think that's exactly right. I would say for the, at least for the listeners as an academic institution, we have a mixed portfolio of industry-sponsored studies from pharmaceutical industry or other types of, developing companies for profit therapies. And about the other half is really investigator-initiated trials. I think the industry-sponsored trials that work well have this ongoing dialogue between the site PI and the pharmaceutical company, where they really review in these early phase trials the experiences at other centers, because I want to know what's going on outside of, with the patients outside of the University of Minnesota. And the only way to understand this is with these ongoing calls. And most studies have a communication call with all the PI site investigators to make sure that everybody's up to date. And this includes the research nurses and all the really research staff that are in direct contact with patients. Our goal is to serve the patients. And the only way to do this well is to make sure we're educated enough to give you beyond our own individual experience. We tend to have a big group of doctors here that see a number of patients. So we really depend on the research team to help us with this communication piece.
There was a question that came in on, is there any ever cases where a patient goes directly into a clinical trial's first-line treatment instead of doing standard of care? I can definitely let Dr. Miller speak to the oncology as it relates to any cancer treatments, because he's probably more familiar with that. But I can say, yes, there are different studies that might be designed differently depending on what you're trying to test. What treatment is it? Where does that treatment fall into your care of the disease and the, disease progression outline?
Yeah, I think that's really an excellent question. The analogy, when I teach students and young investigators in this field. So, think about what I do, very unique cell-based therapy. We're trying to understand the safety in the situations where this works. Almost always these trials, these earliest phase trials are in the patients, at least in the cancer setting, with the most advanced disease. And one of the eligibility is that you've failed standard therapies. Now, on the other hand, if we start to see success, and remember, we're in this to see success, just like you would be as a participant in one of these trials, then we start moving up on the therapy. And there are many, many examples. I think probably the best example for a cell-based therapy is there's a lot of T-CAR therapies, which are genetically engineered T cells from patients that get in a gene to express a receptor to recognize their cancer. And this started off in clinical trials because this was in lymphoma or acute lymphocytic leukemia patients. Once they saw very clear success, it very quickly went into phase 2 studies. The FDA labeling indication was for patients who failed perhaps 1 or 2 lines of therapy. But as these therapies get proven to be better, they start to move up. And I think that all of us in the field are predicting that there is going to start to be trials now with this established therapy in refractory patients or patients who have failed 1 or 2 lines of standard therapy, to start wanting to know in a randomized way whether you should get this therapy on front as a brand new diagnosed patient. Let's say with lymphoma, for example, compared to getting standard therapy and then getting the cell-based therapy at the time of progression. So I am really confident in the academic community saying that as the therapy is proven to work, it gets earlier and earlier. And I think, and Nisha, you could speak to this, but I think it's the desire of pharmaceutical companies when they have a therapy that works to bring it up as early as possible. Pharmaceutical companies are in the business of making money to support healthcare, and the broader the reach of something that works, the better it is for them, the better it is for patients as well. So I think the question's a good one. We always start with the most advanced disease, and as we see success, we move up earlier and earlier to the disease course. And I do think for some of these things we're studying now, that's going to start happening in the next 3 to 5 years.
Exactly. Yeah, we definitely want to make sure that we continue the research, right? And provide that research for new therapies and new treatments that can come to market so it can help patients, a broader population of patients. So when we go to the broader, there was a question that came in earlier that was, how are disparities in patient populations identified and defined in clinical trials? So this is a topic that's very near and dear to my heart. Definitely, yes, there are disparities when it comes to healthcare in general, and it can trickle into clinical trials. And this is why it's so important that each clinical trial has the proper representation of the patients that have the disease. And this includes many types of demographics, from gender, age, race, ethnicity. All these things have different effects in patients, and different patients have different effects to the treatment. So we need to make sure that we can get as many, patients and a wider range of the demographic population into the study, so we have more information, so we know how it works in all types of patients.
Yeah, I agree, Nisha. From my perspective, I think, and we are an NCI designated comprehensive cancer center. I could tell you that I think what we're recognizing in healthcare in general is that there is clearly disparities in the way we give healthcare and we give clinical trials access. And probably the biggest is really this whole access question. I think it is becoming increasingly clear to us that there seems to be a mismatch from our population that we serve and the number of patients from those populations going on in clinical trials. And I could tell you, at least from the cancer perspective, minority populations are as prone to cancer as everybody else. So there is this, I think, really well-documented disparity. I think the best thing we're trying to do at the cancer center level, based on the community engagement who is helping us sponsor these chats, is to really make sure that people get educated. It's not only the ones of you who are listening. I think we all have to be supportive of this access. I am a firm believer that clinical research saves lives, maybe not on the individual phase 1 trial, which is really the safety phase. The biggest risk on those trials is that people will still go on to die of their cancer. But if we don't do clinical research, we're not going to find any of these advances. And, the way that we look at things and the National Cancer Institute looks at these is we should have access to general healthcare and clinical trials and state-of-the-art treatments across the board. And I think that really is dependent on us as physicians, you as the audience listening, talking to friends, encouraging this. I could tell you that the FDA and IRB are in place. I do not know of a clinical trial where the physician actually believed that the trial would induce more harm than chance. So I really think these protections are in place. I think that there are a lot of myths going on clinical trials. You're not a guinea pig. The research has to be well enough advanced to justify to everybody that the risk and benefit is worth the risk and you have a potential benefit of going on to the trial. The IRB does not like to do anything that only has risk and no potential benefit. So please be open with your doctor, your friends, your family, ask questions. We're in different lines of work to support clinical research, but I think part of our job is to educate the community, because remember, we can't do our work if people are not participating in trials. And if there are population differences, where one group may respond differently to drugs than another group, the only way we're going to understand that is to break down some of these barriers and to make sure everybody is studied and participates.
Love that. Exactly. Education is so key, and it starts, you can get education on clinical trials in a variety of different ways, whether it's the internet, whether it's your physician, whether it's your friends, your family members, your caretakers. Keep the dialogue going. Own your own healthcare. I completely agree. We can really remove a lot of the barriers just through education and awareness on clinical trials and how that can play a role in your treatment.
Nisha, there were two questions that I see on my list here. This question is, what strategies do you think would be helpful for community doctors to send patients to institutions performing research? I think it really goes to this educational piece. When we try to advertise some of the trials that we have, I think the key points are not to send out the 100-page clinical trial, because we know that nobody's going to look at that other than us. But I think the key issues for the referring doctors are going to be the disease, the stage, and the basic eligibility criteria to say it's worth it for your patient who might be interested to contact the university and go through this screening process. If they're not eligible for that particular trial, we might also screen them at the same time for other trials. But then if we don't have anything available, we don't make up stuff. We say, look, you don't fit any of the trials we have. We're hoping to have something maybe in the future, and please check back with us. So our goal is really facilitating, and that's what the Cancer Center infrastructure is really all about. The other last question, and then Nisha, there was one for you here on this list. How much does the patient know that there's a lot of unknowns going through the treatment? I think this is a great question. And I got to tell you, I see a lot of doctors dealing with patients. It depends a little bit on the philosophy of the doctor and making sure that they have the time to spend with the patient to go through the informed consent procedure. I can tell you that, everyone who I or one of my groups sees makes it very, very clear to the patient with these very early phase trials, the biggest risk of going on a phase 1 clinical trial is that you're not going to respond to that experimental therapy. Your disease is going to progress. And I think we're very, very honest. We want to give hope, but not false hope. So we tend to be very, very honest. And this is a bit of a mixed bag, because the more honest we are, the more we bombard people with information. And everybody's at very different levels about how much information they can either hear effectively or handle. We recommend that you bring in family members or witnesses, somebody to take notes and help you through this incredibly scary process. But again, we try to be really, really honest. And remember, you have a written document, and this is required by the IRB, that we actually spell out the risks of the trial to you. And those risks really need to be supported so that a third party, the IRB, is reviewing this to make sure that we're being honest to patients. Nisha, there was a question on my list about, let's see, where did it go? How did you get into your field?
Well, I can go quickly do that. So I know we need to wrap up the webinar, but I actually started my career off as a clinical pharmacist. I used to work in hospital setting. Right here, I'm from Philadelphia area, so many of the health systems in Philadelphia. And then I really moved into the pharmaceutical industry, and I was working as basically a scientist on the side. So making sure I apply what I knew from clinical practice into the research, development process for pharma. And I mostly work in medical affairs and clinical research and R&D. But I'm happy to talk, if you have further questions, you can type it in and I can send them my way.
Great.
Yes, certainly.
And just one last comment. There's one question that came up, which is really an important one from a friend of mine. Can I change my mind if I start on a trial? And the question is absolutely. You are not, when you give consent on a clinical trial, this is not a contract to go till the end. If you don't like how you feel on the experimental therapy, whether you're on the treatment arm or placebo arm, you have the right to say, this is too complicated for me in my life right now. And this is absolutely in writing, you have the right to bow out at any time of a clinical trial.
Absolutely, yes. You own your own treatment.
You own your own treatment.
Love that. We'll just have to leave it on that note, unfortunately. But Dr. Miller and Nisha, thank you so much for being here with us today and helping us raise awareness about clinical trials. I certainly learned a lot and I took notes, and I'm sure the audience did as well. So you will all receive an email shortly following today's program with a link to complete a very short survey. We would appreciate if you could spend just a few minutes to provide us with your thoughts and feedback about the session. I know we started off a little bit rocky with technical difficulties, but I really hope that you enjoyed the content that was presented and the discussion that Dr. Miller and Nisha had today. So after you complete the survey, you can then actually enter to win a swag pack filled with goodies from the Masonic Cancer Center. So also the Amazon e-gift cards will be sent out to all live attendees in the next few days. So keep an eye on your email for that. And also be sure to follow the Masonic Cancer Center on all of our social media platforms to stay up to date on the future announcements and events that our office, the Office of Community Outreach and Engagement, hosts. And then again, if you have specific questions about cancer or would like more information on current clinical trials at the Masonic Cancer Center, please call the Masonic Cancer Center Nurse Navigator line at 612-624-2620. And I did share that information in the chat today, but this line is staffed by the most compassionate nurse Monday through Friday from 8 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. So please utilize the resources that we have at the Cancer Center to learn more about clinical trials available to you. And thanks again, everyone, for joining us. And we hope to see you all soon. Happy New Year and happy holidays to you all. Take care now. Bye, everyone.
Thanks very much.
Thank you so much.
Have a great day.
Bye, Dr.
Bye.
Miller.